I'm Connor Old, and welcome back to another episode of Old on Old. And this week we're going to be looking at a classic 80s family film that changed the course and really just cemented that Spielberg in the 80s was definitely the king. If you don't know what I'm talking about The Goonies. So, if you guys are new to this series, what I do every single week is I break down a classic film I've never seen before. I talk about its historical context, as well as my thoughts on the movie, looking at it from a 2018 viewpoint. So I look at why I consider a classic and why it sort of stood the test of time today, and what I sort of think of it, this being my very first watch. And in my mind, is it worthy of that title of being a classic? If you don't know, the plot is about a group of friends who stumble onto a pirate map and go on an adventure trying to find the treasure that the map leads to. In terms of the historical context, the Goonies, in my mind, at least the way I've sort of always seen the Goonies, was it went down as a classic 80s family adventure movie that really kids of the 80s and the 90s really love. Now, the kids of those 80s and 90s, they're now sort of movie critics and people I listen to and people I hear their thoughts on and read and whatnot. And most of those people really love the Goonies. I liken it actually similar to Hook. If you've seen my Connor the Contrarian episode of that movie, I really loved that movie. I saw it as a kid, and I think a lot of people who saw it my age as a kid really latched onto that movie as well, and now, as we're getting older, have started to sort of sing the praises like I do in my Connor the Contrarian episode. Well, I think the similar thing is for the Goonies. The Goonies has had that big success and sort of latched onto a lot of people as a kid, and they sort of wanting to sort of go back to it. At the time, it was a success. It made money. It wasn't a huge runaway success. So the reviews were generally positive. But nowadays, I think that people because people think it's like, oh, this amazing 80s movie, it's one of the classics, it should be sort of labeled and sort of put it amongst that. There has been some resistance, similar to Hook. Some people think it relies too heavily on nostalgia and just the memories you had as a kid, and that the movie itself isn't actually that good. So going into the movie, I tamed my expectations a bit, but I was a little prepared. And while doing the research of the historical context of the movie, it's one of those movies, like I said at the top of the show, where Spielberg, really whatever he touched in the 80s was a success. And this one, if you don't know, he produced the movie, and he also did the story of the movie as well. He also credited as the story. But according to Sean Astin, this is one of those movies where he sort of co-directed or fully directed. Something like The Poltergeist, if you don't know, it's sort of said on set that Steven Spielberg directed that movie. I think it was Toby Hooper who was sort of credited as the main director of Poltergeist, but really Spielberg was the one going and sort of making it happen. So there was that, and then also this movie, he said that it was less of him and Spielberg directing the movie, but he had a sort of director hat on for the entire movie, and he directed a lot of scenes, actually co-directed really with Richard Donner, because at the end of the day, it says his name first. It says a Steven Spielberg production, or Steven Spielberg presents a film by Richard Donner, The Goonies, right? So he has that sort of aspect to the movie. He has his name on it, so he's involved in it. So that's an interesting thing, because you can tell it has sort of that Spielberg 80s magic in the sense of wonder and sense of the adventure, even the score, for example, and the kids aspect of movies like E.T. It all comes together in a very unique way. But that doesn't mean there were some misses with the story. Overall, though, I think I enjoyed the movie a lot. Which, transitioning into my thoughts, I had a good time, but there are some context that is needed for this movie, and I think I summed it up with, I wish I saw it as a kid. That doesn't mean I didn't like the movie. I understand why people dislike it, I understand why people like it, but I understand more of why people like it because of the sense of adventure. This has a classic adventure film narrative. This was a time at like the 80s where you have Indiana Jones and Back to the Future, which it was inspired heavily from the movies of the 30s and 40s of the Seahawk and the Adventures of Robin Hood, and now sort of for a new generation after the sort of cynical era in the 70s where we had sort of a cynical sort of auteur movement has sort of gone away. Now almost the studio system is back in place, and we have the traditional hero, and that's what people want, these big franchises like Indiana Jones, like Back to the Future, like Star Wars. These big franchises really start to accumulate, and now they're we see it from a kid's perspective, which is why I wanted to see it as a child, because the entire movie is from a child's perspective. It has a childlike sense of wonder and amazement to it. It's innocent and family friendly, but it has it in the way I sort of latched onto it was in almost a nostalgic way. I felt the characters were actually very relatable in that way. They worked as a team one way, but then as individual members they worked a little differently. The idea of just sort of the plot is that they're going to be kicked out of their house, and that's why they need to find this money. And it's the idea that kids can't do anything and they're not treated like adults. They're sort of pushed to the side so they can do their own thing, or just going with their friends and discovering all these new things for the very first time. It has an amazing sort of it has a really strong tone to it, and the actors from everyone really nail that idea of going on this adventure, this pirate adventure that is a lot of fun, and in that way I'm a nostalgic person. I find the nostalgia with it, and even though I didn't grow up with it, I wish I had the nostalgia with it. That sort of reckless abandon that I love about kids' movies. And unfortunately though, I love a movie like Hook because I did see it as a kid. I can't love this as much as I would love a movie like Hook, because now as sort of a more intelligent young adult, I can see sort of errors that maybe you wouldn't see as a kid. Because this is from a kid's perspective, a lot of times they can get away with kid logic. Overall I think that this is actually a good family friendly movie, we'll say. But it's not a great family-friendly movie. A movie like E.T. or Stand By Me are great family-friendly movies, because if you take a movie like Stand By Me, which is a similar sort of premise, although it just harkens it a little more down into reality, and it really is ultimately, at the end of the day, those movies are intelligent dramas about children. They're not kids' movies. They're not designed for that. They're really designed for adults, and then the kids come along. And that's not sort of disparaging against kids, but I know even myself as a kid, you watch really anything animated or anything with kids in it, and you liked everything. You didn't really have any taste, you didn't have any judgment. You just watched it, and if there was a story that you could follow, you enjoyed it at the end of the day. And that's why a lot of people have sort of, fond memories of movies like the Goonies and stuff like that. But I think the Goonies is an actual good one in that. There is some flaws for sure. There's a lot of chaotic sort of nonsensical plot points. I think the writers definitely wrote themselves into a corner a couple of times in that sense, where the sort of solution that they had to come up with was sort of completely absurd, and I had sort of rolling my eyes on it. The movie has that kid logic in a sense, but if you watched it as a kid, I can understand your nostalgia for it as an adult, but I also understand why you liked it as a kid, because that's sort of, you don't really think about that sort of stuff. It's like, oh great, they overcame an obstacle. And in that sense, it's a simple movie, because they just go through a linear path, and no matter what stops them, they'll overcome the obstacle somehow, and you think they're not going to overcome it, and then they do. And I think that the movie, to be a great family film, is really missing the sort of key aspects, maybe even more an adult character that they do flashbacks to, or something like that, or even sort of a really smart character that talks about sort of them changing as people, or sort of looking at sort of similar coming of age themes. Even just a sprinkle in there, I think, would be good enough. And then I also mentioned a bit about the kids' dynamic. I did find sometimes that although it worked well as a group, and I liked it overall, some of the supporting characters were very broad stereotypes, and maybe that was sort of a product of its time. It's 33 years ago, so you're going to get some of these different sort of broad generalizations, but I thought sometimes they were a little too broad, maybe a little too cartoonish, and sometimes the film, it leans too much into that cartoonish aspect, and I think if it really wanted to go there, it could have gone there, but it wasn't that. Ultimately, for me, it was a really fun adventure movie, which is kind of something we don't see that often today. We have the superhero movie era, and we're right in this era here, but even the superhero movie genre, with movies like Infinity War and Civil War, are looking into the moral gray area, the politics of it all, almost, And you'll have movies like your Thor Ragnaroks, but then there's always some sort of altering thing that are a little more challenging for the audience, I think, that are not just pure adventure and pure, greatness. I think that's why a lot of people, for example, relate to something like Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade, because it has a little more of that seriousness. That's what you have to do in a third movie. I think in a first movie like this, the adventure is just good enough. It has an amazing childlike wonder. I'm nostalgic for it, even though I didn't even watch it as a kid. It's one of those movies that has that magic, that Spielberg 80s magic, that wonder. That is sort of hard to explain, but it's a mixture of the great kid performances, the amazing score, and the incredible tone that they strike. That the story moves along with ease. It's classic storytelling. It's done well. There are some sort of inconsistencies with the plot, but what are you going to do? I think that you have to watch it from a kid's viewpoint, the way it was intended. You can appreciate it now, but really, I think sometimes they forgot to please the adults that took the kids to the movie theaters in the first place. That being said, great. I enjoyed the movie overall. It gives my sort of seal of approval, and I enjoy the movie. That's about it. Yeah, that's about it. I hope you guys enjoyed the episode. Stay tuned for next week, which I'm going to be doing The Exorcist. That should be a lot of fun. And until next time, stay tuned.